In September 2015, a routine regulatory notice triggered a global recall affecting millions of vehicles. Within days, a company that sold engineering precision as an identity admitted that its cars behaved differently during emissions tests than they did on the road. The market reaction was immediate. Shares fell sharply. Executives resigned. Governments across multiple continents opened investigations at the same time. At the center of the collapse was Volkswagen, a manufacturer that had spent decades building trust through consistency, scale, and technical discipline. The contradiction was difficult to ignore. Vehicles marketed as clean diesels were emitting pollutants at levels far above legal limits, not because of a defect, because of software designed to recognize when testing was taking place. For years, the system had worked quietly. Regulators certified the cars. Customers bought them. Sales expanded rapidly in markets that demanded lower emissions without sacrificing performance. Then the illusion broke. The disclosure did not arrive as a slow leak or investigative exposé. It came as a formal finding by regulators who had finally replicated real-world driving conditions. What they found was not an anomaly. It was a deliberate design choice. In the weeks that followed, the scope of the issue widened. More engines were implicated. More markets were affected. What began as a technical irregularity quickly became a corporate crisis. Volkswagen's reputation, built over generations, unraveled in a matter of days. To understand how such a decision could be made inside one of the world's largest automakers, it is necessary to look beyond the software itself. Long before regulators uncovered the code, the conditions that made it possible were already in place. Volkswagen's rise was built on scale, discipline, and repetition. For decades, the company focused on producing reliable vehicles in enormous volume. Its brands covered every segment, from entry-level cars to luxury performance. Engineering was treated as a cultural constant rather than a marketing slogan. By the early 2000s, Volkswagen had become one of the largest automakers in the world. Global expansion was a priority. Emerging markets offered growth, while the United States represented something else: validation. Success in the US would confirm Volkswagen as a truly dominant global manufacturer. Diesel was central to that ambition. In Europe, diesel engines were common. They delivered strong torque, good fuel economy, and lower carbon dioxide emissions. Volkswagen believed diesel could provide a competitive advantage in markets increasingly sensitive to environmental regulation. The challenge was regulatory. U.S. emission standards for nitrogen oxides were far stricter than those in Europe. Meeting those limits without sacrificing performance or cost required complex after-treatment systems that were expensive and difficult to integrate into smaller vehicles. Volkswagen committed publicly to solving the problem. Marketing campaigns promoted clean diesel as a breakthrough. Engineers were tasked with delivering engines that met regulatory limits while preserving driving characteristics customers expected. Internally, timelines were tight. The company had set aggressive targets for U.S. market share. Delays were costly. Re-engineering platforms or adding expensive hardware threatened pricing and profitability. Still, the strategy moved forward. Diesel models were launched, certifications were obtained, sales grew. The technology was framed as a success. What was less visible was the tension between what was promised and what was technically achievable within the constraints imposed. As expectations hardened, flexibility narrowed. And within that narrowing space, a decision took shape. The core decision did not emerge as a single directive from the top. It formed at the intersection of engineering limits, management pressure, and fixed strategic goals. Volkswagen's diesel engines needed to satisfy three conditions at once. They had to meet strict U.S. emissions standards, they had to deliver performance comparable to gasoline vehicles, and they had to remain affordable enough to support mass-market sales. Meeting all three simultaneously proved difficult. The most reliable technical solution involved additional hardware, including larger after-treatment systems and urea injection. That approach added cost, complexity, and packaging challenges. It also conflicted with timelines already communicated to regulators and dealers. Alternative solutions were explored. Software could adjust engine behavior under certain conditions. Emissions could be reduced during specific operating cycles without permanently altering performance. In controlled environments, results looked compliant. That possibility changed the calculation. Instead of redesigning engines or delaying launches, software offered a way to reconcile conflicting demands. It did not require new hardware. It did not affect everyday driving in a way customers would notice. And it passed official tests. The assumption was narrow but critical, that regulatory testing conditions were predictable and limited, that real-world driving would not be examined with the same scrutiny, that enforcement would rely on certification, not continuous verification. Once that assumption was accepted, the solution appeared contained. The software was embedded. Vehicles were certified. Production scaled. What began as a workaround became part of the standard configuration. Over time, the distinction between temporary compromise and permanent solution disappeared. The decision was no longer revisited. As diesel sales expanded, the system became harder to unwind. Admitting the limitation would have required recalls, redesigns, and public acknowledgement that the promised technology had not been delivered. So the software remained. And with each new model year, the commitment deepened. The first warning signs did not come from regulators. They came from discrepancies that were easy to dismiss. Independent researchers began noticing that real-world emissions did not align with laboratory results. On-road testing showed nitrogen oxide levels far higher than expected. At first, the findings were treated as methodological noise rather than evidence of manipulation. Volkswagen responded with technical explanations. Differences were attributed to driving behavior, temperature, or fuel quality. Software updates were issued and described as routine refinements. Regulators accepted the explanations and moved on. Internally, the gap was understood more clearly. Engineers knew the vehicles could not meet standards under all conditions. The software was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, but the system relied on a critical condition remaining true: that no one would look too closely outside the test cycle. As diesel sales expanded globally, the risk increased. More vehicles meant more data. More markets meant more regulators. What had once been a controlled exposure widened into something harder to manage. By 2014, pressure began to mount. U.S. authorities requested detailed explanations after repeated inconsistencies appeared in testing. Requests turned into demands. Technical discussions became formal inquiries. Volkswagen attempted to resolve the issue quietly. Internal teams explored fixes that would not reveal the underlying mechanism. Temporary solutions were proposed. None fully addressed the discrepancy without exposing the original design choice. The margin for deflection narrowed. What had been manageable as an internal compromise was becoming an external liability, and the questions were no longer coming from one direction. The turning point came when regulators stopped accepting explanations. In 2015, U.S. authorities required Volkswagen to account for persistent gaps between laboratory results and on-road emissions. The tests were repeated under varied conditions. The discrepancies remained. At that stage, the issue was no longer technical. It was procedural. Engineers were asked to explain how emissions controls behave differently in testing environments. The answers became narrower. Internal justifications ran out. What had been framed as calibration nuance was no longer defensible. Under increasing pressure from Environmental Protection Agency and California Air Resources Board, Volkswagen acknowledged the existence of software that altered engine behavior during certification tests. The admission changed everything. What regulators had suspected as non-compliance was now confirmed as intentional design. The scope widened immediately. More engine families were implicated. Other markets began reviewing certifications issued years earlier. Public reaction followed quickly. Volkswagen halted sales of affected models. Senior executives resigned. Governments announced investigations across Europe and Asia. The narrative shifted from emissions performance to corporate conduct. Financial consequences accelerated. The company set aside billions to cover recalls, penalties, and legal claims. Credit ratings were reviewed. Share prices fell sharply. What had been a contained engineering workaround became a global crisis. Internally, production schedules were disrupted. Development priorities shifted. Resources were redirected toward damage control rather than growth. The decision that had once saved time and cost now demanded both. And unlike earlier moments, there was no path back to quiet resolution. The disclosure could not be contained. It spread across jurisdictions, brands, and years of production in a matter of weeks. The consequences unfolded across multiple fronts at once. Regulators in dozens of countries reopened emissions certifications. Lawsuits were filed by governments, consumers, and investors. Criminal investigations expanded beyond the company to individual decision-makers. Recalls affected millions of vehicles worldwide. Some cars required hardware modifications. Others received software updates that altered performance and fuel efficiency. In certain markets, buyback programs were offered to resolve claims more quickly. The financial impact escalated rapidly. Volkswagen recorded charges that eventually exceeded $30 billion, covering fines, settlements, vehicle repairs, and legal costs. Profit forecasts were revised. Investment plans were delayed or canceled. The disruption reached deep into operations. Engineering teams were reassigned. Compliance structures were overhauled. Internal reporting lines were reorganized to reduce the concentration of authority that had allowed the decision to go unchallenged. The scandal also affected the broader industry. Diesel sales declined sharply in several markets. Regulators adopted more rigorous testing procedures, including real-world driving assessments. Certification processes that had relied heavily on laboratory results were rewritten. Trust eroded unevenly. Some customers remained loyal. Others abandoned the brand entirely. The damage was not uniform, but it was persistent. What had once been framed as a narrow compliance issue became a defining event for the company. And it continued to shape decisions long after the initial disclosures faded from headlines. In the years after the disclosure, Volkswagen remained intact as a company, but not unchanged. The legal process extended well beyond the initial settlements. Criminal cases concluded at different times in different jurisdictions. Some executives faced charges, others reached agreements. The outcomes varied, but the scrutiny did not fade quickly. Operationally, the company shifted direction. Investment accelerated into electric vehicles. Public commitments emphasized transparency, compliance, and cultural reform. Governance structures were adjusted to prevent technical decisions from being isolated from ethical oversight. Sales recovered unevenly. In some markets, the brand regained momentum. In others, diesel never returned to its previous position. Consumer perception stabilized, but the association with the scandal remained part of the company's identity. Regulatory environments changed as well. Emissions testing became more complex and less predictable. Real-world driving conditions were incorporated into certification. The gap that had once allowed software-based workarounds narrowed significantly. Yet the system that produced the decision did not disappear entirely. Large organizations still face pressure to meet fixed targets under technical constraints. Timelines remain rigid. Trade-offs are often resolved deep inside engineering and compliance teams, far from public view. Volkswagen's crisis did not begin with malicious intent announced at the top. It developed through a series of constrained choices that accumulated into a single, irreversible outcome. When the software was revealed, the damage was already embedded across years of production and millions of vehicles. The scandal did not hinge on discovery. It hinged on how long the decision had been allowed to stand. And once exposed, There was no way to separate the technology from the trust it had compromised.